as Greta Thunberg joins other activists in France to stop the construction of a major highway. Predictions come in of a weakening El Nino at the start of its alter ego, the cooling of Pacific waters.
There isn't a guarantee that La Nina will emerge this year, but it's looking more and more likely as it goes.
Coming up, we break down these complicated weather systems.
This El Nino event began after 3 years of La Nina. And those 3 years of La Nina did a lot of things to the global climate.
And an unknown vessel creates a massive oil spill on a tiny Caribbean island, the effect on local tourism, and who authorities think is responsible.
The area of this spill makes it difficult to pick up an IMO number.
Just 2 degrees starts right now.
The situation is not under control.
A new 53-kilometer highway in France is being constructed to connect the cities of Castres and Toulouse. The government says the A69, as the stretch is called, will better connect people living in rural France to the rest of the country. But that's not what environmentalists think. That's the chant. Young people from France, Spain, Belgium, and Sweden joined Greta Thunberg to resist the project. They say it contradicts national commitments to fight against climate change. This isn't the first time protesters have tried to disrupt the process. Last year, they used bricks and cement to barricade the road. One activist was even on hunger strike for 40 days.
We are here because we are against this project. We are here to show our support and solidarity with those activists who have come here, activists who are local residents, who are resisting this project, who are defending the nature and the land that will be sacrificed for this project. It is absolute madness that this is going ahead, that we continue to throw people under the bus, and that we continue to waste resources on something that will both destroy nature and lock us further into this destructive system.
El Nino occurs naturally every 2 to 7 years, and its effects last year were predictably unusual. Fast forward to February 2024, and atmospheric scientists say the climate phenomenon is losing its strength.
Extreme weather at the start of 2024 came with the announcement of a year so hot, global temperatures exceeded 1.5 degrees across an entire year for the first time on record. In Chile, plumes of orange smoke covered parts of the country from late January as wildfires ravaged some 430 square kilometers land.
Esto era un infierno.
In Colombia, 400 wildfires ripped through mountains, moors, and forests.
Nosotros tenemos incluso como autoridades ambientales dificultades con procesos de restauración y procesos de reforestación cuando hay sequías prolongadas.
And up to 40% of Tuvalu's capital district is still underwater. The small Pacific island state is threatened by what authorities call king tides. Extreme rain from Cyclone Bilal submerged cars in Mauritius. And while many enjoyed an unusually warm winter in parts of Europe, a historic storm drenched much of California in early February, triggering flash floods and mudslides along the hills of multi-million-dollar mansions.
El evento del Niño, con un aumento en las temperaturas del océano, genera un aumento, genera variabilidad climática. Por más precipitaciones en ciertas regiones o ciertas zonas, o déficit hídrico en otras zonas. Esto hace que contribuya a la temperatura, al aumento de temperatura que ya hay en el mundo debido al cambio climático. Entonces, esto también genera ciertas condiciones, un contexto también para que los incendios sean más extendidos y más intensos.
But El Nino won't live forever. Atmospheric scientists say the weather pattern has begun to lose strength and will likely be gone by spring of 2024. Researchers can't predict the exact date, as the system is driven by cold winds and the displacement of warm waters. And when it does finally end, it won't be long before the La Nina season begins.
Well, let's talk about the prediction that La Nina, El Nino's opposite, could develop by summertime. We spoke with Roundy, an atmospheric scientist at the University of Albany. He breaks down the relationship between extreme weather and El Nino and what we can expect during the transition to La Nina. Okay, so maybe Paul, maybe you can start by giving us your assessment of the 2023-2024 El Nino. Was the weather that we've seen since it started unusual to you?
So this El Nino event began after 3 years of La Nina. And those 3 years of La Nina did a lot of things to the global climate. One of them was to charge the middle latitude oceans in the Western Pacific with more warm water than would normally be there. And the other was to trigger drought in some areas. For example, East Africa had several seasons of drought associated with the La Nina events. But then between March and May of last year, there was a rapid transition where the East Pacific switched from being cold to being anomalously warm. And that warm signal realigned the rainfall patterns of the tropics, and that forces changes in the atmospheric circulations year-round and tends to make it wet in places that are usually dry and dry in places that are usually wet. The El Nino event itself was on the strong side among the top 4 events of the last century. So quite strong, but not as strong as the one in 1997, 1998, and 2015, 2016.
Oh, so they've been previously stronger El Ninos.
Oh, yes. 1997, 1998 is probably the strongest on the historical record when we have good data. There may have been a similarly strong event in the late 1870s. But it's
El
hard
Nino
to
events influenced by human activity?
That's a bit difficult to assess. Climate change increases the amount of what we'll call it long wave heat radiation that comes down from the atmosphere toward the ocean, but it also changes the cloud distribution. And if it were just the long wave radiation coming in, the ocean would accumulate warmth faster than it did in the past, which might allow for El Nino events to happen a little bit more often. But the climate models are really conflicted about this point. Some of them don't simulate El Nino very well, and some of them create it too often or not often enough. And the way that El Nino events look in climate models isn't sufficiently similar to observations for me to trust what they would predict in that particular context.
Paul, now we're hearing that El Nino is weakening. How is that measured or forecast?
So we measure El Nino strength typically by the sea surface temperature of the Eastern Pacific Ocean along the equator. We've drawn little boxes, and the real world, nature doesn't like to fit in these boxes perfectly, but we call them the Nino boxes. So there's Nino 1 and 2, which is next to the coast of South America, Nino 3 and Nino 4, going toward the west toward the Central Pacific. And in between them, we have this Nino 3.4, which means the Nino box in between Nino 3 and Nino 4. And Nino 3.4 is the main box that we use. We average across the equator, and in that region of the East Pacific, the difference from normal sea surface temperature. And when it's above normal, larger than half a degree, we call that El Nino. And when it's negative, more than half a degree colder than normal, we call that La Nina.
Okay.
But El Nino typically maximizes in its intensity around December, and this year was no different. It's typical after December that El Nino events weaken because the normal sea surface temperature of the East Pacific starts to rise. And when the normal temperature rises, the difference between what is El Nino and what is normal becomes smaller, because you can't warm above some amount. So the highest it can get, the warmest it can become in an El Nino event, typically becomes less and less different from the normal. So the East Pacific right now is actually warming a little bit, but the anomaly, the difference from normal, is shrinking. And that shows up as a weakening El Nino signal.
I really appreciate you making this simple to understand. Let me ask you one more question before I let you go, Paul. So when El Nino does end by late spring as forecast, and La Nina begins, what does it mean for summer? Will summer be cooler than anticipated? And will winter be what winter used to be before El Nino?
Yeah, so it's complicated. Looking around the world, there are different signs of impacts. So some parts of the world are made colder, and some parts of the world are made warmer during El Nino, and vice versa for La Nina. Same thing for rainfall. Some parts of the world get more wet, and typically during El Nino, the places that get more wet are places that are normally dry. But this all flips around, and then places that are normally wet get wetter than usual during La Nina. There isn't a guarantee that La Nina will emerge this year, but it's looking more and more likely as it goes. Oftentimes, an El Nino event might end and just return to something neutral for a while. And then we have multiple El Nino events that develop in a row. 1991, 92, 93, we had several weak El Nino events come back. But the strongest El Nino events move out a lot of the warm water volume of the Pacific Ocean, and that makes it a lot less likely that you get another El Nino event following a strong one. And so it increases the chances that we go to La Nina this year.
For billions of animals, survival means being on the move to find food, mates, and favorable conditions. Wherever they go, the harmony in their habitats depends on their habits. They shape landscapes, balance populations, and create even as they destroy. But many are under threat.
A new UN study called The State of the World's Migratory Species reports human activity is driving 1 in 5 species listed as threatened to extinction, an existential threat also to the habitats they support. Take, for example, Great Barrier Reef green sea turtles. Their feeding habits make seagrass beds more productive. They fuel biodiversity by transporting barnacles, algae, and other species on their backs. Like many with life cycles spanning hundreds of thousands of kilometers, their journeys are timed to suit their needs. But warmer waters have hatched more females than males and affected migrations. Many turtles arrive at feeding and breeding grounds too early, too late, or not at all. Habitat loss from development, commercial fishing, and fishing nets have all dropped their numbers by 90% over the past 50 years. But attempts to conserve dwindling species have proven successful. The humpback whale, traveling thousands of miles, is a giant carbon sink. It absorbs 30 tons of CO2 every year, taking that to the ocean floor when it dies. The way they feed, poop, migrate, and dive spreads nutrients for phytoplankton that create oxygen and also absorb carbon. These gentle giants were hunted nearly into extinction, but a ban on commercial whaling in 1966 has seen their population increase from 1,400 in 1966 to 21,000 today. There are several ways to help others at risk regain their numbers. The UN report calls on the international community to expand protections for migration routes, take down fences, strengthen anti-poaching laws and reduce fishing bycatch, cut environmental noise and light pollution, and consider animal migrations in any plans to build. But these are just recommendations, and existing protections are often enforced by naming and shaming. The kind of help that thousands of migratory species might need will take much more.
Kaddu Sebunya is CEO of Africa Wildlife Foundation. We talked about the significance of such a sizable number of species that are at risk of extinction.
Really, what he's saying is that we are in trouble because we know science is telling us that we are reliant on nature for us to survive on this planet. These species are responsible for a lot of the ecological systems, what I call ecological infrastructure.
Can you, you're in Kenya, can you give an example, a practical example, so people can understand exactly what's at stake? I guess if you like, you can name an animal that's at risk, talk about its impact and its need in the ecosystem that it lives in, and what happens if it disappears.
Oh yes, I mean, we've been around for 60 years working across the continent, and we follow 5 key species, the lions, the elephants, the rhinos, and the apes as our key species that indicate what's going on with the ecological systems in Africa. The lion population has declined by over 67% in my lifetime. That's the last 50 years. And this is critical. The lion play a bigger role in our ecosystem. Elephants, in 1970s, we had more than 1 million elephants. Now, the elephant population in these forests has declined by more than 75% in the last 40 years. They are responsible for maintaining the ecological integrity of the Congo Basin forest. It's critical for our climate change.
You know, one big reason I believe that these animals are at risk is because of human development, human expansion. What do you think is the alternative? Do you think people should just stop building new homes, starting new businesses, taking away from the land to expand their own economics?
Actually, there are 2 reasons, especially in Africa, why these have been declined. Most, I mean, there are so many reasons, but 2 main ones. One is our behaviors as a human species, the way we've been managing nature, and our own aspirations has caused and impacted these species. The other side of it is the way we've done conservation of the continent too. So it's double-sided. The idea that we can develop and exploit unsustainably nature has caused the decline in species on this continent. The main driver of it is habitat decline because of our demand from nature. Conservationists, in return, we've been for a very long time trying to protect wildlife from people.
You've talked about, in the past, you've talked about the elite needing to get more involved in conservation efforts and in protecting the environment. How exactly do you think they can help?
Well, in Africa, when you talk about elite, you're talking about young Africans. They are the most educated Africans that have ever lived on this planet. Majority of them are below 40, so they are the elite group on the continent. They are not involved. The reason has been really the approaches we've used on the continent dealing with the conservation. The protections idea, we've been protecting wildlife from Africans. Majority of people who have been doing conservation on the continent are non-Africans. The leadership of conservation movement has been non-African led for good reasons, and they mean well. And perhaps without them, we would have had a major decline. But Africans ourselves have outsourced that responsibility to non-Africans, and the results are not very good. The second reason is really the disconnect. As we've been urbanized, a lot of these young Africans live in urban centers. There's a detachment from their way of life, from nature, but also the conservation has been mostly led by science approaches. The conversation has been so scientific, and majority of Africans with indigenous knowledge have thought that this is a sector that really must be a scientist to really know how to do conservation or do the work in conservation. So majority of Africans haven't been really involved because of lack of the science aspect of it. The last point has been, they're not role models.
An oil spill off the coast of Tobago has caused panic on the Caribbean island. Authorities were notified on February 7th about the slick, which polluted around 15 kilometers of coastline of an island that's just about 40 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. Tobago is heavily dependent on tourism, and the spill took place during the popular carnival season, which attracts tens of thousands of tourist street party goers annually. The Prime Minister said it was unclear who the vessel belonged to.
We have no idea where it came from, and we also don't know all that it contains. What we do know, it appears to be broken, having made contact here, and is leaking some kind of hydrocarbon that is fouling the water and the coastline. That vessel could have come to us from any kind of operation, especially if the operation is illicit.
We got an update from Tobago's top official, Farley Augustine.
To be honest, somehow it was missed by all of the state agencies responsible for border patrol and border control. And so we find ourselves in this mess. The Sentinel imaging has showed us that it was leaking some 12 kilometers before it made its final resting spot. That when we look back at the Sentinel imaging from last week, Tuesday thereabout, we saw the trail of leak leading to the final resting spot where it is right now. But I'm happy to say that we have been able to contain it within the 15 kilometers. It has not gone beyond that area. We have currently controlled it to the extent that we are managing the outflow of the spill. Oil is still emanating from the vessel. However, it's coming out of the vessel in a very controlled area. And we are then using skimmers to be able to extract the oil from the water. So we certainly have
saved... Whose vessel is this? Who's responsible for the spill?
That is still unknown at this point. And that's because the area of the spill makes it difficult to pick up an IMO number. And so what has to happen is that we have to get rid of the oil to be able to pick up the IMO number. The areas are also a bit difficult for divers because the currents are pretty strong in that area, the surface currents. And the vessel, as we speak, continues to bounce up and down on the seafloor, making it a bit cloudy. Visibility is only about a foot in some areas around the vessel because as it bounces on the floor, it creates a dust pool. So now that we have contained this spill, meaning that we have entrapped the spill in a very confined area, and we are doing the extraction, we are looking to stabilize the vessel today so that we can be able to pick up the needed identifying markers and ensure that we can manage the process going forward. But certainly, whomever is responsible will be made to pay for this disaster.
Hundreds, possibly thousands of people normally flock to Tobago to enjoy the beaches after Carnival. Has the spill had an impact on post-Carnival celebrations?
No, it has not, because fortunately, that 15-kilometer radius, most of it involved on uninhabited coastline, where we just have virgin lands and rugged coralline limestone coastline. The areas that the post-Carnival revelers will flock to, such as Pigeon Point, Boku Reef, Nylon Pool, Storby, all of those areas remain completely unaffected. This occurred on a portion of the Atlantic coastline. So none of our very popular white sandy beaches, none of our very popular reef areas have been affected because we were able to move fast enough to contain the spill and to keep it within that 15-kilometer coastline.
And that's our show. Here are pictures of dozens of newly found ocean species in the waters around Spain's Canary Islands. They've made scientists rethink just how much life is still to be discovered and how global warming affects them. The ocean is vast, covering around 71% of the planet. yet only 5% of it has been explored.
Just like we imagined, perfect summer. Perfect summer. See what happens.